As the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues to dominate headlines, mercenaries have reportedly been deployed on both sides. From Russia, special forces were deployed to Ukraine before the Russian invasion began, while contractors have allegedly recruited former military agents to join the fight against Russian forces. The use of private companies and mercenaries in Africa isn't an uncommon practice. Many South African mercenaries often get hired to help fight battles in other countries. Is this a legal practice? Well, to help answer that question is criminologist Dr. Guy Lamb. Dr. Lamb, thank you so much for your time. Let's start off with the distinction between private security firms and mercenaries. Is the latter just a euphemism for, I beg your pardon, the former just a euphemism for the latter?
Well, I mean, we have different distinctions here. I mean, mercenaries, there is a very clear term within law and within legislation. It's really around soldiers of fortune, those who have specific military skills, who are hired by government to go and engage in military acts, whether it's about fighting an opposing state or it's engaging in internal armed conflict. In more recent times, you've seen distinctions between private military companies and private security companies. Of course, within South Africa, we have many private security companies. The private military companies now, certainly since the late 1990s, have done much more professional type of role than what mercenaries typically tended to do. So we saw mercenaries during the formation of states within Europe, with wars between princes and monarchs. And we sort of seen them happen, and they've played certain roles in Africa during the decolonial process. You've seen mercenaries try and play a role in overthrowing governments. So we've seen that happen. But the term mercenary is now seen as quite a negative term. So it's used largely to kind of reject and to criticize these forms of actions. But these days, we typically talk about private military companies, and then often the term mercenary relates to those two.
Why would Russia, in particular, need mercenaries? I mean, the size of their army much bigger than the Ukraine. So why would they employ mercenaries or private armies as opposed to just using their own forces?
Well, I mean, it's not exclusive to Russia. I mean, we've got a number of countries that do that. For example, the United States makes use of a number of private military and security operators in a range of conflicts. So we saw them being used within Afghanistan. We saw them being used in Iraq. They've been used in parts of West Africa in terms of counterterrorism. And so there's a whole process around that. And they've been used for fighting, but also for security, VIP security, and for training and for security sector reform. And so often, politically, it's much easier to use private military contractors because, when they die, there's not such a political consequence. Often it's around if they do something that violates laws, then you can distance yourself from it. So the same thing is applied with Russia. So Russia's been increasingly using private military companies. The most prominent one is called Wagner. So Wagner, for example, was used within Mozambique. It was hired by the Mozambican government in the first attempt to try and defeat the insurgency and violent extremism in Cabo Delgado. Now, Wagner left. It wasn't successful there, but it's been very prominent within Central African Republic. It's been prominent within Libya. And it's a way of sort of foreign policy implement on the part of the Russian government. It's around, it's easier and more controllable to use private military. And there's also this plausible deniability. To say if they do something wrong, then you can say, well, actually, they're a private company. They've got nothing to do with us. In the case of Ukraine, you can use private military because you can mobilize them very quickly. And also in the sense of around, you can, as I say, kind of distance yourself from any specific actions that take place. And often these private military companies have very specialized skills, and you can get them to do the most dirty parts of that war and say, well, that's actually nothing to do with us. It's this company.
Yeah. Do South Africans still feature heavily in these private contractors? Are there still a large number of ex-South African soldiers that take part in these operations? And if you're a South African, is it legal for you to join them?
Well, there is legislation around it. So, for example, we have something called the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. This goes back to the late 1990s, which actually was an anti-mercenary act, and it was actually brought in response to Executive Outcomes, which was, one of the more prominent private military companies that existed. It doesn't exist anymore. It kind of wound up as affairs and new companies were created. So if you are a person who wants to work for a private military company or private security company overseas, you need the permission of the South African government. So there's something called the National Conventional Arms Control Committee. So you have to apply through their directorate, and then they apply criteria to approve or not approve. Of course, they're rarely approved because most of this is happening in conflict zones, and South Africa's law on that says we shouldn't be, allowing people to go and engage in certain areas that contribute to destabilizing those places or contributing to armed conflict. So usually permission isn't granted. But we've had, individuals from South Africa who've gone to take up especially contracts within Afghanistan, not so much anymore, obviously, after the US withdrawal, in Iraq. So these were big money spinners for many South Africans, especially from the security forces, who would go there because they would be paid in dollars. It would be very good money, nice way to supplement your income. So you take unpaid leave and go. But the earlier period where we had executive outcomes and others, that kind of period's over. So you see a few individuals who were involved in that point in time, someone like Evan Barlow, who's set up a number of other companies and works throughout Africa doing private military business and is fairly well respected for that. It's controversial, but fairly well respected for it. But we don't see the level that we saw in the 1990s. We saw large numbers of ex-SADF people going to go and fight, as executive outcomes did within Sierra Leone, as they were involved within Angola. We don't have that level. And many of those individuals are now much older. They're in their 50s and 60s, so they certainly don't want to be doing any fighting. But yet we see South Africans who are running or managing some private military and security companies.
All right, Dr. Lamb, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. That was criminologist Dr. Guy Lamb.